Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Clifford. I'm the director here in Rural Community Network, Northern Ireland. We're a membership-based organisation working right across rural Northern Ireland, addressing issues which are the causation of poverty and disadvantage, but also, I suppose, trying to express a desire as an organisation for thriving rural communities and sustainable rural communities. In the last number of years, we've been engaged in a project which was European-wide or UK-wide. And today is the culmination of the end of that piece of work. So before we go through all of where the background came from, the first thing I want to do is kind of highlight for you who's on the call today and who will be presenting today. So the running order is that I will do a welcome, an introduction and a background to the project that we've been engaged in, which is the 5G New Thinking project. After that, I'm going to hand over to Soares, who's from the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, who's joined us today, and he has actually written the report, which is around this policy landscape for remote working and rural development in Northern Ireland. And then we will be joined by Gareth Evans from DERA, who will talk to us about how this fits with the rural policy framework for Northern Ireland and the rural connectivity theme. We're also joined on the call today by Aidan Campbell, who has been instrumental as our policy officer in pulling the policy work together for us on this piece of work that we've been doing. And also want to thank Nicholas Hanrahan, who's also part of the Centre for Cross-Border Studies. So it's a very informal session, folks. The formality, I suppose, is at the start, is at this introduction bit, and Anthony taking us through the key findings of the report. And then we'll get into a question and answer session at the end. So if you bear with us as we work through. So today we're launching a report that was commissioned by RCN, but undertaken by the Centre for Cross-Border Studies on our behalf. The title of the research is The Policy Landscape for Remote Working and Rural Development in Northern Ireland. And it's a comparative study between what's happening in policy terms in the Republic of Ireland and what is already available within Northern Ireland, but what also needs more attention or what needs to be more joined up and where some of the gaps are. As many of you know, we RCN is an organisation which has always had an ambition around thriving and well-connected rural communities. This 5G New Thinking project, which we were engaged in, was launched in January 2000. It was an ambitious project with 18 partners launched right across the UK. There were a number of rural communities who were involved in that project. The consortium was about a test bed for 5G to enable better connectivity within communities. And we looked at why some areas, very remote areas like Dumfries and Galloway's, the Borderlands region and the Orkney Isles and Northern Ireland were without proper or decent connectivity, either through mobile networks or through fibre and broadband. The project was designed to enable community groups to think about how they might connect better and how they might even instigate their own network development. As we began to roll the project out, Project Stratum took off in Northern Ireland, and we had full fibre to premises and fibre connectivity being improved in rural areas across Northern Ireland. So we knew immediately that the project wasn't going to stack up in the same way in Northern Ireland as it was in other regions. And so we decided we would look at how do we then, with this investment that has happened, how do we support communities to take advantage of what has been a digital revolution of sorts since the COVID pandemic took place. In November 2021, RCN took a group of people from Northern Ireland who were interested in looking at digital connectivity and its potential for rural regions and for remote rural working and for new rural development initiatives. We took a group of people to the Western Development Commission and hugely grateful to them for hosting us and taking us through the lessons that they had learned. They talked to us about the national hubs network that they had developed and looking at how they were supported through a background policy, which enabled connected hubs right across rural Ireland to kind of build on the capacity for remote working, digital hubs, and innovation and the use of technology in developing thriving rural communities. We saw how it was operated, we saw how it was supported by government and government policies, and from that we were interested in what are the policy conditions that might create a similar scenario in Northern Ireland where groups, particularly groups in remote rural areas, might take advantage of digital technology and the digital revolution that has happened over the last number of years. So that's to give you a little bit of context of where we came from. We then sought about finding someone to pull that together for us, and that's where the Centre for Cross-Border Studies came in, and they did this comparative between North and South. So I'm not going to take up any more time. I just want to thank everybody for being on today, and then I want to hand over now to Anthony Soares, who actually wrote the report for us, and Anthony's going to take us through the 8 key findings of that report.
Thanks very much, Kate, and I'm just about to share my screen as I join you here from the Centre for Cross-Border Studies offices in Armagh. So you're very welcome from wherever you're joining us today, and I'm really grateful to Kate there for the introduction, but she kind of has highlighted already some of the key kind of themes in terms of this report. And I'm just going to go through, focus on actually the 8 recommendations that are made in the report and give some context as to why we arrived at those specific recommendations. So in terms of what the research objectives were, really it was looking at what the policy context in Northern Ireland is for remote working, and always with a focus on what that means for rural Northern Ireland, for communities in rural Northern Ireland, considering what actions could be taken to exploit the potential opportunities for remote working in support of community and social benefit in Northern Ireland. But as we do this, as Kate mentioned, it's taking what's happening on the other side of the border in the Republic of Ireland in terms of remote working, and particularly remote working and its connection to rural development. And from that comparative study is then to provide some recommendations in terms of where the way forward for Northern Ireland in terms of remote working and rural development. But just to highlight, in terms of this, policy is the focus, what's happening in the policy context in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But in terms of the report itself, we also spoke to various key policymakers, key practitioners, and people who in the Republic of Ireland have gone through the development of the policy and seen what's happening on the ground in terms of practice. How is that policy actually happening on the ground? And in terms of that, what is happening on the ground, we come to, let's say, one of the first issues that was highlighted in the work that we undertook for this report. If we look, for example, to the Office of National Statistics, it does gather statistics in terms of what are people's working patterns. What are they thinking about, whether they want to work from home, a mixture of working from home and working from the office, and that has been undertaken by the ONS. We have here figures or a glimpse of that work from the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, from 2022, but another set of data has been released for the 2023 period. So it's kind of looking since COVID, so during COVID, but then after COVID, what are people's feelings in terms of what they want to do in terms of returning to the office or working from home? But here we run up against the first challenge. These particular statistics gathered by the Office for National Statistics on people's intentions of working from home or mixture from home and the office, they're only for Great Britain. So Northern Ireland is not part of these statistics in terms of the ONS. If we look to the other side of the border in the Republic of Ireland and the Comparative Institute, the official Central Statistics Office, they undertook a pulse survey. Now, if you look, it was a survey done in November 2021, again, looking at what are people's intentions in terms of working from home. And you can see there that 88%, now this is back in November 2021, 88% would like to continue to do so when all pandemic restrictions were lifted. So this is really still at the pandemic stages. Obviously, these statistics are really important in terms of if we're thinking about investing in remote working, and particularly in terms of rural development, it's where are people going? What are their thought processes in terms of what their intentions are going forward? But a really important set of statistics, again, in the Republic of Ireland, are these national surveys. So they started in 2020, undertaken in 21 and 22. Again, very important national surveys, again, looking at in terms of what people want to do in terms of working remotely, a mixture of working from home and working from the office. And again, the statistics show a real strong appetite for working from home or a mixture from home and office. So these are national surveys that look at what are people's intentions, what do they want to do, undertaken in the Republic of Ireland. If we turn to Northern Ireland specifically, really we only have one major report that did a survey in terms of people's intentions of working from home or a mixture of home and office. And this was a report done by Ulster University Economic Policy Centre. It was a report done in 2022 or published in 2022, but the survey was undertaken in November 2021. So it's what were people feeling like in November 2021 in terms of working from home or mixture home and office or returning to the office. The statistics actually did show most people did not want a full return to the office. They wanted either to work from home or mixture from home and office. But this really is the only set of statistics for Northern Ireland. So it's going back to this, if we're thinking of how we're going to invest in terms of remote working and specifically what that means for rural Northern Ireland, we need to have a picture of where people are at in terms of their intentions, whether it's employees or employers as well. So this is where the first recommendation actually comes, why we arrived at this first recommendation. It's in order to have a picture of where people are at in terms of their intentions going forward. The pandemic obviously forced that move to remote working, but we're beyond that now, and well beyond that now, hopefully. So where are people now and what are their intentions at the moment? So the first one is, in order for policymakers to have that ability in terms of thinking about investing, is to gather that data. So there's various options here put forward. It's either the Office for National Statistics extends what it already does, but includes Northern Ireland within those statistics, but it doesn't do that at the moment. Or the Northern Ireland Statistics Research Agency, NISRA, starts collecting that data, seeing where people are at in Northern Ireland in terms of remote working. Or if neither of those are considered viable, to actually engage someone else who already has collected that data. So here perhaps a strong hint for the only organisation that seems to have done this, Ulster University Economic Policy Centre. They've done the survey once. Perhaps it's a matter of engaging them to continue to gather that data so that we do have a clearer picture in terms of where we're at. But if we turn to the policy landscape in terms of remote working and rural development, and we look to the Republic of Ireland, that's key comparator that we were using in terms of this research. And we go to the central policy, the keystone, which is the programme for government. And Ireland's programme for government has within it, it has within it priorities, objectives set around investment in infrastructure that will facilitate working opportunities and foster enterprises in rural Ireland. And it also talks about developing a national remote working policy to facilitate employees in working from home or from co-working spaces in rural areas. So in terms of the policy landscape and remote working and the connection between remote working and rural development and rural communities, you have these key elements within Ireland's programme for governments. It mentions there a national remote working strategy. And that's the other key piece in terms of the policy landscape in the Republic of Ireland around remote working and connections to rural development. The Republic of Ireland does have a national remote work strategy, and it is very detailed. It has a whole host of elements within it, a whole host of priorities, many of them linked to rural development. But I just perhaps want to hone in on one particular aspect of that remote work strategy, where it talks about remote working hubs. And so within that mention of remote working hubs, it talks about mapping and classification of hubs across the Republic of Ireland, and looking at national data on hub infrastructure, so knowing what's out there in terms of hubs, mapping of skills, commuter patterns, childcare facilities to actually inform future hub development decisions, and also assess how those existing hub classifications can inform future funding decisions. So it talks here about the classification of hubs, getting a picture, a national picture of what's out there in terms of hubs, remote working hubs. So we had program for government, you have a national remote work strategy, but obviously you also have rural development policy itself, and obviously in the Republic of Ireland, that rural development policy is our rural future. And again, within that, the digital landscape, remote working forms an important piece in that particular policy around rural development. So it talks about transforming digital connectivity for rural communities and enterprises through delivery of high-speed broadband. And Kate, right at the beginning, mentioned what's already happened in that sense in Northern Ireland. One of the other elements that it talks about is promoting remote working in the public and private sectors and improving digital skills. So the Republic of Ireland's key rural development policy document has within it a whole raft of ideas, objectives, priorities in terms of remote working, digital skills, and infrastructure for remote working as well. So that's the report has much more detail around these policies and others, the policy landscape in terms of remote working. But I want to turn now, because we're not saying that everything, that there's a vacuum in terms of the policy for remote working and rural development in Northern Ireland. Quite to the contrary, we do have important policy drivers in Northern Ireland around remote working and rural development, and none more important than the rural policy framework for Northern Ireland. And I'm just highlighting here in terms of that particular policy, just the two headlines, because within the document itself, there's more detail around how these are to be worked out, the plans of how to put flesh on the bones of these. So the two key headlines there is supporting balanced regional development by promoting better connectivity between urban and rural centres, and the other one is supporting improved telecommunication structure through high-speed broadband. But these are just the headlines. There's detail, there's much more detail in terms of these two key headlines within the policy document, because there's a lot more in terms of what remote working, digital connectivity can mean for rural development in Northern Ireland. So there's just one example of the policy landscape in Northern Ireland and what it has to say about remote working and its connection to rural development. But here's another key policy document, which also has, so within Northern Ireland, also has mention of remote working and its connection to rural development. And obviously this is the Department for the Economy, a 10X economy, the central policy document for the Department for the Economy, which obviously mentions how the COVID pandemic has kind of driven this massive change in terms of attitudes to remote working, but it makes that connection between that change and the opportunities that this offers to people living in rural Northern Ireland, and seeing how this might drive a change in terms of where people work from. So keeping people within rural Northern Ireland, not necessarily having to commute each day into Belfast or other cities in Northern Ireland. So those are just two examples. Again, the research report offers other examples of policy drivers in Northern Ireland that have a connection to remote working and rural development. But before I move on, I just want to say that I mentioned earlier on that the programme for government, the Republic of Ireland, has remote working within it and a connection to rural development. It has a strategy around remote working. But I would just want to make a reminder that Northern Ireland's programme for government, or the draft programme for government, the way that was left, one of the key things for that programme for government was around regional development or balanced regional economy, paying attention then to a distribution of economic activity within Northern Ireland. And I think that is an important aspect that we should remember in terms of that central programme for government, or draft programme for government. So I'll turn now to the next recommendation. So looking at what's happened in the Republic of Ireland and looking at what exists in terms of policy drivers in Northern Ireland, the recommendation here is really to bring together, and this is for the Northern Ireland Civil Service, to really look at audits existing core government strategies and policies to identify elements relevant to remote working. So look at those different departmental policies, these different policy documents, and bring them together, and using those, develop a single coherent policy document in remote working in Northern Ireland. One coherent policy that brings the various policies that are there in other departments, bring them together into one central document, a bit like the remote working policy that the Republic of Ireland has. However, that isn't the only thing, obviously. What the National Remote Work Strategy in the Republic of Ireland noted was the need for a cross-government approach. So the Irish government, looking at what was happening in the Republic of Ireland, understood that there were various initiatives happening across government in different departments, and it says that while there has been some collaboration between various organisations, various departments pursuing that work in terms of remote working, that it's a fragmented landscape, and they point this as potentially resulting in confusion on the definition, purpose, and impacts of remote work because of a lack of a whole of government approach, as different people are working on remote working and in terms of rural development, but doing it in their different areas and not necessarily with a central connection. The Rural Policy for Framework for Northern Ireland mentions this as well, and it remarks quite rightly in relation, for example, to connectivity. Priority intervention related to connectivity fall within the policy remit of other government departments, and they will require collaborative working. So within one of these policy documents that we have in Northern Ireland, there is a recognition that this isn't a job just for one government department. It needs other government departments in Northern Ireland to come together to drive this transformation or grasp the opportunities presented by this drive to greater remote working and what it might mean for rural development. It needs a whole of government approach. And here we come to our third recommendation, and here I must give thanks to Kate, who came up with this working definition, or this working title. It's the need to establish a digital uplift into the departmental group to include within its remit remote working. So one group at the heart of government to drive this remote working initiative, led by either the head of the civil service or a designated permanent secretary, and to consider then and these already exist to some extent, to consider departmental groups being established that would feed into this into departmental group. So it's this need for a whole of government approach in order to really exploit the opportunities presented by the move to remote working. In terms of what's happening in the public sector and specifically maybe the civil service, if we go back again to what's happened in the Republic of Ireland, within the programme for government, there's a commitment made that public sector employers, so that this isn't just civil servants, public sector employers, colleges and other bodies should have moved to 20% home and remote working in 2021. So a target set in the programme for government for people within the public sector, the wider public sector, moving to home and remote working by that date. Now, I have to say that if we go to Northern Ireland in terms of people looking at this within the civil service and the public sector, it was actually happening years before that. In 2010, there was a debate report that was looking at the Northern Ireland civil service. And one of the conclusions within that report was that the Northern Ireland Civil Service and other public sector bodies in Northern Ireland should move to finalise and agree policies on remote and home working as a matter of urgency. This is from 2010. So well ahead of the curve within the Northern Ireland Civil Service, there were already people thinking about this need to move to some element of remote and home working within the public sector. As we were undertaking this report and we were talking to various people, both in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, in terms of what the experience has been in terms of encouraging employees within the public sector to move to some element of remote working, whether at home or at hubs, what we got back was suggestions by interviewees that if they didn't see their senior civil servants engaging in remote work themselves, so if they weren't seen to be doing it, then more junior civil servants would be reluctant to do it or have some apprehensions about doing remote working as an element of their working pattern, fearing that it somehow would impact on their careers, their progression, if they didn't see their senior colleagues doing the same. But this wasn't just within the public sector. As you're speaking to people in the private sector, there was that same feeling. Unless the bosses were actually engaging in some form of remote working themselves, then employees felt less positive about engaging it in case it worked against them. So both within the public and private sector, in terms of those we interviewed, they were of the opinion that those in the position of leadership required a change of mentality in relation to the adoption and management of remote working. So they themselves adopting remote working and also how they manage that remote working for their employees. So that leads us to our fourth recommendation, which is about leading by example and supporting the promotion of remote working practices in Northern Ireland, both in the public and private sectors, with the most senior members of the civil service and also the private sector adopting some element of remote working themselves and ensure that career progression is not impeded by remote working. So encourage it, lead by example, promote remote working, and ensure that you have processes in place that allow people to progress in their careers as they adopt some element of remote working. So moving on to remote hubs. If we look at what's been happening in the Republic of Ireland in terms of remote working and remote working hubs, back in May 2021, Ireland's Minister for Rural Community Development so this is in 2021, had set a target of having over 100 hubs connected by the end of that year, and with an overall target of 400 remote working hubs identified and mapped by what was known as the National Hub Network Working Group. So this is in 2021. There's already a recognition that there are lots of hubs already appearing in the Republic of Ireland, and this recognition of a need to somehow map them and connect them with each other. Now, the existence of all of these hubs in the Republic of Ireland led to the need to classify them, because there are all sorts of different types of hubs or were appearing, have appeared, and are still appearing in the Republic of Ireland. So connected hubs, i.e. introduced a classification of hubs. I'm not going to go through the detail. All of this is in the report, so please do look at the report, and it has more detail on those. So those various categories of hubs, including co-working hubs and community and enterprise hubs. So a classification of hubs. But looking then at the experience of hubs in rural Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, and speaking to those who are involved in policy, those who are working in remote and rural hubs, those who have some connection to rural hubs, what came back was a few things. One is lack of awareness of rural hubs, which is seen as a challenge that needed to be addressed. But the other thing that really came out was from experience in the Republic of Ireland, and particularly or specifically rural areas in the Republic of Ireland, they were quite concerned that hubs that appeared in rural Ireland, whose core function as hubs weren't necessarily aligned with the needs of their populations, were going to struggle. But the other thing that really came out strongly was where there's a lack of managerial and entrepreneurial skills required in leading a successful hub, then hubs in the rural Republic of Ireland would have challenges in terms of succeeding. So it's also the person leading, the person managing these hubs, really important, and the right kinds of skills. But while they saw that these were real challenges, they were also contrasted with really successful examples of rural community and enterprise hubs that really did meet the needs of their communities and invested resources in continually adapting what they were offering to their communities and engaging with various other sectors within their community. So there's a kind of collaborative element to this. So organizations coming together, sharing spaces in terms of these hubs, making connections. So it's what you have to offer. In many cases, what was coming through was hot desking isn't enough. Plugging into the broadband isn't enough in order to make these hubs successful. There has to be another offering. There have to be other things that would encourage people to make use of such hubs in rural Republic of Ireland. I just want to, just as a kind of a segue, turn to an example of what's happening in the local authority level, but more specifically, one example of a cross-border network of local authorities, and this is from ICBAN, Irish Central Border Area Network, which really brings together local authorities who are in really rural areas of the island of Ireland. And you have here from their framework of regional priorities an identification of remote working and what it might mean. So talking here about remote working becoming more established, how digital hubs will become more significant for rurally isolated communities. Also heightened opportunities to invest in the further development of digital innovation hubs and hot desking facilities across that central border region. So here you have at local authority level a kind of, and this is just one example, but it's a particular example, a cross-border local authority network looking at the potential of remote working for rural communities. So I'm coming here to what's happening in Northern Ireland as well in terms of opportunities, what's happening in terms of remote working, digital hubs, different sorts of hubs. And I'm just giving here two specific examples. And it's what's happening in terms of city and region deals and what their plans in terms of hubs and digital infrastructure. So I'm just picking here two examples. So the mid-southwest region, talking about a network of state-of-the-art digi-hubs in their region, talking about digitally advanced co-working spaces, but also Derry and Strabane City region, talking about supercharged with cutting-edge hubs focused on health and life sciences and data-driven innovation to drive their regional economy. So I talked earlier about kind of policy documents from like rural development documents, also mentioned there the Department of the Economy, what it says, but there's other stuff happening at kind of a regional level. And here it brings me to the fifth recommendation, kind of to follow the example perhaps of what happened in the Republic of Ireland. It's this mapping exercise, looking at what exists already, what is being planned in terms of digital hubs, but not just hubs or digital hubs, but also those that are providing digital skills in Northern Ireland, and to classify them and refine them to the local circumstances in Northern Ireland, adopting the classification system used by Connected Hubs in the Republic of Ireland. But as we do this, as we look at what exists or what is planned in Northern Ireland, particularly in rural Northern Ireland, we need to take an approach that doesn't just have a singular focus on organizations that identify themselves as hubs, but also those who are offering services such as skills associated with the notion of hubs. To have a kind of a wide approach to that mapping exercise. Now, in terms of hubs and the public sector, so I mentioned earlier in terms of the programme for government in the Republic of Ireland, that target of people working within the wider public sector, a certain percentage adopting aspects of remote working. But in terms of that experience, this is from a report by the Whitaker Institute and the Western Development Commission, looking at remote working. One of the things that they found is that while that remote working it's welcome that remote working is to be promoted within the public sector, showing its leading policy by example. It then makes mention of hubs, the development of hubs for civil servants. And what they point out is that specific hubs for public servants only may undermine the economic sustainability of all hubs, including publicly funded hubs. So it's this development of hubs only for civil service. What does that mean in terms of planned hubs or existing hubs, specifically in rural communities? What is that going to do to that landscape? Remote working hubs and the public sector in Northern Ireland. Here I'm just making mention of a statement made by the Finance Minister back in 2021, announcing the establishment of hubs across the region to allow civil service to work closer to where they live. So it's happening in the Republic of Ireland, it's happening in Northern Ireland as well, this development of hubs, remote working hubs in Northern Ireland as well. But looking at what it has happened in the Republic of Ireland and some of the kind of concerns there in terms of those remote working hubs developed just for civil servants. The other recommendation here then, looking at, so this Connect 2 hubs is the programme for the civil service in Northern Ireland. It's to investigate the feasibility of opening up these regional hubs under that Connect 2 programme to rural enterprises and community groups, to open up these spaces, to make the connections and to be aware as these Connect 2 hubs are being put in place, what is already out there in that landscape as they enter it, and make those connections in order to ensure that you exploit those connections to the maximum. And I mentioned earlier on these regional deals, these city deals that we have in Northern Ireland and their plans around digital hubs, remote working, and this brings us to another recommendation. So these plans are really talk about very specific sectoral hubs, wanting to plan or develop different aspects of the economies of industry within their particular regions. So this recommendation is about encouraging those sectoral hubs especially those who are in receipt of public funding, such as those related to advanced manufacturing, agri-food, communications and information technology, and fintech, to provide spaces to rural enterprises and communities for the delivery of relevant digital skills and to contribute to an entrepreneurial ecosystem. If these hubs are being developed in these very specific sectors, in these sectors that are seen to be will be drivers of the economy, make sure that you give opportunities for rural communities to get the skills that will be needed to be part of that new economy, those new drivers of the economy, by allowing them into these sectoral hubs. I'm coming now to the final recommendation, and here it's to support the establishment of a platform for the sharing of best practice among rural digital hubs in Northern Ireland. Learn from each other. Those that exist already, those that are being planned, is to make the connections and learn what is happening, what is best practice, and connect with best practice in the Republic of Ireland. I'm coming to the end of this real quick tour of the report. I'm just going to put here some of the key ingredients for success that were identified as we were doing the research for this report. Now, Northern Ireland always has some of these to some extent. So this alignment between core policy and different strategies at government level, a remote working policy and a strategy to implement it. Perhaps that's the bit here that we really have to work on in Northern Ireland. Investment in digital infrastructure. We in Northern Ireland have done that. It is there, and especially in rural Northern Ireland. Supporting the growth of digital spaces and entrepreneurial ecosystems, and recognition of the need for provision of childcare and investment in digital skills. And that investment in digital skills is happening as well in Northern Ireland. So these are some of the key ingredients of success. But I'm going to leave us with this last thought. I was talking earlier about leadership, the need to lead this, the need to promote this, because there is the potential that the tide might already be going out on remote working and rural development. If there isn't that promotion, if there isn't that leadership, if people don't see senior people within the civil service, if they don't see senior people within the private sector adopting some element of remote working, if the policies aren't there, the policy drivers aren't there in a concerted manner, as we kind of move further and further away from the pandemic, there might be more and more people starting to go 100% back to the office, back to commuting, back to Belfast, unless we make sure that we encourage that remote working and we encourage the development of hubs where they make sense and make those connections, look at what that best practice is, what's happening in the Republic of Ireland. So I just want to alert us to that possibility. The tide might be going out and we need to catch that tide. We must make sure we exploit the opportunities presented by remote working. And that is all from me. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that, and I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Thank you, Anthony. That's really good. Thank you so much for that. It's a whistle-stop tour over a really important document. We are very keen, Anthony, in taking forward the recommendations, and I think when you look at the policy context in the South and you look at the enabling policy drivers that are there, there is an opportunity now to grasp this nettle, if you like, and to grasp the opportunity and to move forward. And with that in mind, I'm going to talk to the architect of the rural policy framework for Northern Ireland. Gareth, I see you giggling. Gareth Evans has been a long-term friend of rural development across Northern Ireland. He was instrumental in bringing the leader projects right across Northern Ireland and supporting rural development over the last, Gareth, will we say 20 years and be generous? Or is it?
Well, you could say 22.
Okay, so following on from Anthony's report, Gareth, I'm going to ask you to speak into the rural policy framework and particularly the rural connectivity theme that is in the new policy framework document. So I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Right, okay. Well, I think Anthony painted a very good picture there, and it's some really strong links back into our framework. If I cast my mind back to January 2020, we had a large stakeholder event in Loughrea College, where we were actually launching a report in each of the 5 pillars, and connectivity is within pillar 5. And at the end of the event, people were asked to indicate what was their #1 issue. Connectivity, I think, came out something like 99% of the audience thought it was the most important issue. And it's quite interesting, because that was January 2020. And in March 2020, as you all know, COVID hit, and something that was fairly important in January became extremely important in March and going forward. And I'm a big believer, if there's good in something, it's nice to see it brought out. And one of the things I think that COVID has done is it has really put front and center remote working and the ability to work remotely. And I honestly think if we hadn't had COVID, we probably would be at least 18 months behind where we are now, maybe even 2 years behind. So the policy framework has a number of priority interventions buried within it to take forward how we deal with digital and connectivity, particularly within rural areas, between rural areas and urban areas. On another part of the department, or within rural affairs, we're also involved in Project Stratum. And again, if you want to start joining the dots up, if you can't get the connectivity, you can't think about digital hubs. So Project Stratum has steamed on fairly dramatically, and certainly within another year, I think we'll be talking about something like 99% coverage of the whole of Northern Ireland with ultra-fast broadband. Now, 5 years ago, people would say that wasn't possible, but it is possible, and it will be possible. And people are starting to see the benefits of those things. But I think that certainly as a government official, if we don't actually build on the network, and we don't start looking at what can we do with digital hubs, what can we do with encouraging digital clusters, getting people involved in mentoring programs to improve their skills around digital, then we will have wasted whatever we've done, the money we've invested within Project Stratum. So going forward, we did have a small social enterprise scheme there a couple of years ago, and out of it, 2 digital establishments were put in place. And I use that term very, very specifically, because for me, people need to understand certainly what a digital hub is. A digital hub is not somewhere that you hot desk. You can hot desk in any building with a computer and a connection. A digital hub is beyond that. And I think if we're aiming to improve the offering across the board within rural areas and create employment, which is ultimately what we should be trying to do through a digital means, then we need to fully understand that meaning of a digital hub. A digital hub to me is somewhere where you can encourage businesses out of Belfast to set up sub-offices around rural areas. And I think if we start getting towards that goal and working towards that goal, that's something that to me is very achievable. Anthony touched on a few different things there, like city deals. I mean, I'm aware of a city deal going on in one of our rural towns that will see a fully fledged digital hub being established in an old building. And they've already had 2 or 3 companies who have said, look, if you do that, we will establish sub-offices in that building. And once you start to do that, then you start to create employment opportunities, and you stop people driving up the road to Belfast. And crucially, you also reduce the carbon footprint, which is very key. There was a lot of talk there from Anthony around what they're doing in Southern Ireland, and Southern Ireland is probably a couple of years ahead of us at the minute. That's reality. They grabbed the nettle very early on, way before COVID. I actually live in Buncrana, County Donegal, and about a quarter of a mile away, they're about to open a very large digital hub where they will be encouraging businesses to come in and set up. On a recent meeting with our colleagues from Department for Rural Communities and Development in the South, we met in a digital hub in Dundalk, and it was fantastic to go into a building. You looked along one wall, and there were about 6 separate small companies set up within this one building, all working away. The lady who introduces the building told us that 2 had set up, word got out, and all of a sudden half a dozen set up. They had then had another company who's come in who actually do bespoke computer furniture, and they've set up on the building now as well, and they're actually getting business from these other 6 businesses. So to me, the way forward is fairly clear. We need to really concentrate on trying to develop proper digital hubs. There is funding coming out through Peace Plus, and there is a call for, I suppose you'd call it expressions of interest at the minute. I think it closes today. But within the 2.4 measure smart villages, there is the ability to create, to transform existing buildings into proper digital hubs. What we're also looking to see around that is that on the back of that, then that those groups actually implement mentoring programs, digital mentoring programs to improve people's digital skills, whether that's aimed towards business, whether that's aimed towards people who just who have never connected to any digital means before, to kind of bring them up to speed and get them better connected, or whether it's providing better education for kids after school. All those things are really important. Digital clusters, again, Anthony hit on that. We would like to see cross-border digital clusters starting to occur, and I think that the first thing you need to do that is actually the physical cluster. You need the physical hubs before you can actually start developing the clusters. And I think, again, going back to what I said a wee minute ago, the South has a lot of the hubs, so we need to catch up in the next couple of years. We need to create those hubs. We need to get involved in these digital clusters. And I think there's really, really good opportunities then for innovation-led social enterprise as well buried within this. And it's something that, and this is a personal opinion, something we're not very good at in Northern Ireland is social enterprise. We are getting better. And I think the opportunities around the digital side of things are absolutely massive. And again, it goes back to having the initial building block, and the initial building block is the digital hub. So within going back to the policy framework, we are hoping that as we roll forward, we will develop initiatives to help support and form and possibly build digital hubs. But even without us doing any more, there is funding coming through now under Peace Plus. There's definitely funding coming through under some of the city deals and complementary funds. And I honestly think that 2 years from now, we will be looking at a very different landscape. And hopefully we'll be able to go back and look at Anthony's report and say, well, actually, yeah, number 1 we've done, number 2 we've done, number 3 we've done. I think we are, and I again go back to COVID, I think we're in a very, very different place than we were in 2020. And hopefully, if we can now just get people to get enthused, to start putting through the applications and start developing the projects on the ground, I think we have a fairly bright future. And I honestly, hopefully, don't think that we will go back to the days of loads of people driving down the motorway to Belfast. Especially from the civil service point of view, the civil service has now gone down this road of kind of hybrid working. So it is encouraging people to work from home or work nearer home. There's still a bit of office work involved, but again, for the civil service to take that big step is a major thing. That doesn't happen very often. But I think certainly in a couple of years' time, I would expect things to be very, very different, and a lot more cross-border working, etc., going on, and definitely a few digital hubs where at the minute there's not too many in Northern Ireland.
Great, Gareth. Thank you so much. Thanks for that input. And it's really good to get the insight into what's happening from the department's perspective and what your ambitions are around that as well. I think for us, there's a job of work to be done in terms of marrying up the ambitions of not just the civil service, but also the business community with what's happening in rural communities, and marrying up those ambitions, but also then, as Anthony has said in his report, pulling those policy frameworks together and encouraging people to see where the linkages are and about how, when working together and putting our heads together and putting our shoulders to the wheel, we could have thriving rural communities, with digital transformation being at the backbone of new enterprises which are developed, but also enabling communities to thrive because people are accessing good childcare and good resources, but they're able to work closer to home. But also that whole idea about driving the digital agenda, driving new developments within areas. We've seen it with the Ludgate Hub in Skibbereen and Cork, where they're driving, digital is driving the creative community there. They're producing screen, they're producing films. The kids in primary schools are learning digital skills. But that hub has become much more than just a hot desking space. It's also become an entrepreneurial space. And that really would be our ambition for around, and it won't happen in every community, but some communities it'll really fit and it really work for. Okay, we're at the point now, folks, and I'm well aware that the time is creeping on here. I do want to give some space and some time to open the floor to questions. Do we have any questions coming through? Or does anybody want to join in now and to ask a question on? I'm going to read out from the chat here. Congratulations to Anthony and the centre staff. It's a global issue in some sectors in Argentina. The temptation of going back as a 100% office scheme is present. We have to adopt, at least consider best practices. Thank you. That's from Buenos Aires. Excellent. Great reach. And Aidan, I agree with Gareth's point, relocation of high-tech jobs into rural communities. Of conversations being had between Invest NI about making this happen. Any conversations, Gareth, that you're aware of between rural groups or DERA and Invest NI about high-tech jobs into rural areas?
Not that I'm aware of, Kate, but I am aware of a city deal that Belfast Council are taking forward under digital transformation, and which hopefully, as a department, we will be providing all these funding questions are answered over the next while, but we will be putting some funding into it. And that really is targeted at micro and small businesses, both rural and urban. And it is all about digital transformation. It's not about going in and replacing laptops and PCs. It's about what actually producing a digital development plan and then providing funding to take that forward. I'm also aware that there's at least one other council is looking at going above that particular grant scheme again and providing funding that hopefully will be used for things like robotics and cobotics and businesses, which again all plugs back into the whole IT offering. So at the minute, that would be as much as I'm aware of. It's not to say that Invest and I aren't involved in those conversations.
Okay, there's a question in here from Andrew. Is there any support or revenue or staff support over the first critical 2 years, I would say, of establishing a hub? Is anybody aware of or Gareth, this is probably directed at you?
Again. Well, the only thing I could say is certainly anything that's funded under Peace Plus, there is the ability to put revenue costs in there as part of the overarching project. And I mean, Peace Plus is looking at big stuff. They're not looking at 20, 30,000 pound projects here. They're looking at the big 200, 300,000 pound projects. And certainly the ability is there to put some kind of revenue costs in alongside the capital.
And Gareth, is that something that can be written into any future sort of funding stream? Because again, the report that Anthony has produced has said how vital that person is, and that person is the linkage, but more than that is the person who actually drives the development, the connection into the community and the connection with business. And that's absolutely, it seems to be an essential part of making a hub work. So for me, I suppose a recommendation from here would be that, and as Andrew's question rightly asks, is, that support for development staff should be a part of any sort of capital investment.
I think generally, I mean, any funding, even the leader funding we did in the past, the ability was there to put in some staff costs. I think I suppose as a civil servant, it pains me to say, but revenue is always the hard one to get.
Yeah.
But certainly, if you're doing a fairly large capital project, you can put revenue in, and you can do the little civil service trick is you capitalise it, because it's an enabler for the main capital item. Then it basically becomes part of the capital. So there is ways and means of doing it, even at the minute.
Okay, that's great, Gareth. Thank you for that. There's a comment here from Paul Roberts. Very timely paper with excellent recommendations. Hubs have the potential to be a catalyst for rural regeneration, but they won't if they've too narrow a focus. And that's absolutely what Anthony's report is saying, Paul. So thank you for that. From Debbie then, thank you. Great presentations. Anthony, you mentioned presentation about a management buy-in of remote working hubs. Can you advise how to go about this, especially managers who may be reluctant to enable this? So yeah, Anthony, I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, and that is a challenge. But it is looking at the experience in the South. So people that I interviewed noted this as a challenge, as a particular difficulty whether it's within the civil service or within the private sector, if they don't see their bosses adopting some element, so it's not 100% remote working, but adopting some element of remote working, then they themselves are less reluctant to do so. So even if it's there on paper that you can do remote work, if they don't see their leaders doing it, then they might start it, but then gradually they'll just start coming back into the office again every day because they don't see their bosses actually doing it themselves. And it's that thing about thinking you're missing out on something. If you're not there in the office, everybody else is, and your boss is there all the time, then you're missing out on something. But in contrast, there were also those who pointed out to examples where the bosses did take that leadership role, were adopting remote working practices, were working from home on some days. And not only that, it was those bosses who, and this is in the private sector especially, where they did have a presence in some remote working hubs. So it's companies that might have had their headquarters in Dublin or somewhere else, but had hubs outside of Dublin. And the bosses, the managers will deliberately make sure that meetings were held not in the Dublin office, but actually in one of the hubs and bringing people into those hubs. So it's showing leadership. It's if you're going to have hubs, regional hubs, especially in the private sector, it's then the leadership, the managers must make use of those hubs themselves, hold meetings in those hubs. Because one of the things that also came out, and this is not just the private sector, it's also the community sector, the community voluntary sector. It's having the ability to have those conversations, not just within people within your own company or even within your own sector. It's hubs as a place where you can actually speak to people who are using a hub, but come from a completely different sector. And that is something that people said is a real positive of hubs, but then hubs have to offer that kind of networking possibility, that it's not just about a desk and plugging into broadband. It's hubs that actually offer these opportunities to network and meet those other people. But just to emphasize, leadership is great when leaders make use of their hubs themselves.
Brilliant, Anthony. Thank you for that. Folks, I'm very conscious of time. We said we would cut off at 1:30 today, and we've gone over that slightly. If there are any last minute burning questions, I'll take maybe one more. I see some people have to drop off already in the chat box here. Really enjoyed listening. I'm from CACA, the International Public Policy Observation Northern Ireland QUB. Definitely feel there's some opportunity in digital hubs and tackling rural isolation, which may occur for long extended periods of remote working. The absence of standardised remote working policies in Northern Ireland across the UK might make it difficult to raise requests when you don't know what your rights are. Absolutely. And I think there's not an organisation across Northern Ireland that hasn't struggled with the hybrid working policy or with policies for digital and remote working. I think it is, and absolutely there's a real gap there, and thank you for pointing that out. everyone that we have spoken to post-pandemic who are trying to balance the hybrid, you know, in terms of just people working from home and working in the office and when people are expected to be back. We know some organisations, including the likes of the Housing Executive and Department for Communities, their buildings are either under renovation or they've sold their buildings and they don't have the capacity to bring all their staff back. And so they're working on hybrid policies, but there's lots of people who want to be back in the office and there's others who never want to go back to the office. But there certainly isn't a possibility that they will ever have all their people returned, but they're still struggling with how do we balance all of this. So it's a really interesting point, and thank you for raising that. Gareth, you have your hand up here.
Yeah, I was just to pick up on the point Anthony made there about you know, some of the things you can do once you have these digital hubs and bringing people together. There is an organisation called Grow Remote, who are extremely good at doing that. And I was fortunate enough to bump into the two girls who kind of organise it and run it, and Aaron Moore, when we did a study visit, and believe it or not, the week before COVID. If you look it up, it's a great organisation, and they do build these networks right across the board. And once they get the networks in place, they do things like bringing people together, you know, to look at a particular subject matter, say it was Sage accounts or something like that. You know, they have the ability to do that. So, and they also have opportunities for people working and jobs and things like that as well. So, grow remote, well worth looking up.
Brilliant, thank you, Aidan. Aidan's just popped it there into the chat box for us, Gareth. Can I just say a massive thank you before we finish, first of all, to everybody who attended today, to Aidan from RCN, who helped to pull this together, to Anthony and Nicholas for the work that they did in terms of putting the report together and organising, and Nicholas has been in the background today organising the chat box and all the functions, so thank you for that. Anthony, thank you for the report and for your constant dedication and support and pushing us to make this relevant and to keep it relevant and keep it on the agenda. And that look to north, south, east, west is absolutely essential in the work that we do as a rural agency. Gareth, thank you so much for your input today and for taking the time to come along and to give us that insight into what's happening with the rural policy framework. So folks, the report is available and it's online on RCN's website. The Grow Remote contact is in the sidelines here. And please just keep in touch with us. We're really keen to push these recommendations forward and to take them into both the civil service, private and the community and voluntary sector. And please just keep in touch with us if you have ideas about how we might help to change this landscape for rural areas in the future. Thank you, everyone.